Welcome back to Filling in the History. Sorry, I did a thing and I look a little different, but I am still the amateur historian here. I won't maybe look like this for very long, but you know what? Sometimes the beard giveth and the beard taketh away, and sometimes I taketh the beard away. So that's what we've done. So for those of you who are only listening, then maybe you should just keep listening and not have to worry about how I look. That's probably wise anyway. But anyway, yeah, welcome back. I hope you appreciated last week. That was a kind of a departure from what we've done. If you're not aware, last week was the King Follett Discourse, which was a very influential, very influential discourse in the history of the church. This week we're going to be getting back to it. So we're going through sections 37 through 40 of the Doctrine and Covenants, and we're going to have, I believe, just two parts today, which is going to be mainly because 37 and 38, 37 is kind of short, so I'm going to pair it with another one. And then 39 and 40 are paired together. They're both revelations to James Covell, or Covell, as you will. And I'll probably call him Covell. And then we're going to have a revelation that was designated do not print. So what in the world was that? So we're going to get to that in a moment here. So let's start with part one. Starting with section 37 of the Doctrine and Covenants as we have it now. The earliest copy that we have is from Revelation Book 1. It is entitled The 40th Commandment. We've made it all the way to 40. There are a few spelling and grammatical changes by W. Phelps in Revelation Book 1, as you can see. It is chapter 39 in the Book of Commandments and section 58 in the original Doctrine and Covenants. There is no section heading difference between 1981 and 2013 in this particular one, except for, of course, taking away a reference to the history of the church. Kind of a short commandment, but very potent. There's a lot of things. This is kind of where the church starts asking quite a lot out of its members in the history, is the way that I would interpret it. So getting into some of the circumstances surrounding section 37, and this will go into section 38 for sure. The circumstantial introductions to this, so Revelation Book 1, the intro that it has says, a revelation to Sidney Rigdon and Joseph at the time that they went from Fayette to Canandaigua, I think it's Canandaigua, to translate, etc., given at Canandaigua, Ontario County, state of New York. I think I'm probably saying that wrong, so forgive me. I don't know how to say it. Anyway, it's a very simple revelation, in a very simple introduction to a revelation that we get in chapter 39, 58, Book of Commandments. It's usually like revelation given to somebody at this place on this time. So yeah, very simple there. The manuscript history gives us a little more. It says, soon after the words of Enoch were given, the Lord gave the following commandment. So if you're reading in the manuscript history, and this is not the way that the documents does it, so I'm not going to dive too much into it because it's a little out of order, but in the manuscript history of the church, what you get in between sections 36 and 37 is what are called the prophecies of Enoch. And today we would call this Moses chapter 7. So this is part of the translation of the Bible, and it is separated off into the book of Moses. So you might have remembered this before. This was the vision of Moses, or Moses chapter 1. That's in there. This particular one is the words of Enoch. And just to give a little bit of this, this is Enoch giving a prophecy after he becomes a seer. So he is this is sort of a patriarchal era, if you're not familiar with the Old Testament. So you have like Adam, and there was Abel and Cain, and how that whole thing went down. And then there was Seth and, Jared and, some, all the patriarchs that come through. I don't have it memorized in order, sorry. But eventually you get to Enoch. And Enoch was a massive figure in this era, and especially in the early history of the church in terms of the Joseph Smith translation and what that means. And there's a lot of references to this in sections of the Doctrine and Covenants. So if you're not aware, this vision of Enoch, he sees the future. He sees the creations of God, very similar to what Moses had as his experience. And then what we do is we get into that the city of Enoch and this idea of Zion. And apparently Enoch pulled it off. And for 365 years, this city that Enoch built was so righteous that the Lord eventually took the whole city up unto himself. And that is sort of the ultimate Zion society. And there's been a lot of Zions throughout a lot of different religions, and so this definitely resonates. But because of this, um, there's this huge filling in of what we have in Genesis, as opposed to what we get in the Bible, which is just, Zion is fled because he was not, right? Instead of just that phrase, we get, all of this prophecy, and I love it at the very, very end of the prophecy. It says, hence the saying, Zion is fled. So you get this huge, robust story about Enoch, and that's all kind of in between those in the manuscript history of the church. And again, you can read this all you want in Moses chapter 7 as we currently have it today. And so the idea of Zion and gathering and, separating ourselves from the world and all that kind of stuff is going to be a very important part of the church for many, many years. So keep that one in mind. Nothing really in between sections 36 and 37 in Documents Volume 1. So this is just from the history side of it. What I will dive into a little bit is Histories Volume 2. So this is John Whitmer's history, which was an assigned history, but something that was written by John Whitmer. And we've spoken about this in a previous episode where he's really using a lot of scriptural language, right? It's, and it came to pass that Sidney, journeyed to, New York and met with Joseph the seer. And he really puts it in a lot of spiritual language. It's kind of fun to read that way, actually. But we get this quote about the introduction to this same revelation. It says, "Now after the Lord had made known what he would that his servant Sidney should do, he went to writing the things which the Lord showed unto his servant the seer. The Lord made known some of the hidden things of his kingdom of God. For he unfolded the prophecy of Enoch, the seventh from Adam. After they had written this prophecy, they, the Lord, spake to them again and gave further instructions." And then he quotes section 37 as we have it today. And so the revelations indicated that the church members would now eventually gather to a city which would be called the New Jerusalem. So in a previous episode, again, we talked about one of the first missions where Oliver Cowdery led a mission troop. They went out west to preach to the Lamanites, so to speak. But one of the things that they were really doing was searching for the location of the New Jerusalem. They went back because the Pratts knew about the Campbellite movement. They went back. That's when Sidney Rigdon joins the church. He goes to New York, becomes one of Joseph's confidants, and helps scribe the translation of the Bible that he was doing. And just as a recall, because I think it's fun, the original scribe for this project, this Bible translation project, was Oliver Cowdery. Emma Smith joined in, John Whitmer, which makes a lot of sense because he's the scribe for quite a lot of these early things. And then it becomes Sidney Rigdon. So this mission was, we're going to preach to the Lamanites, or as we would call it today, the Native Americans. That was Lamanites was a term that the early church used for various reasons I won't get into right now. But they were to preach to these natives. And they did have some success there. And then they, as they were preaching along the way, met up with the Campbellites. That turned into a big thing with Sidney Rigdon, and that was all in Ohio, in Kirtland, Ohio. So Sidney comes, and it's quite a successful mission. So, but part of it was also finding this New Jerusalem, a place where they would settle. Now we can get into the papers themselves. The Documents Volume 1 historical introduction to this says, in late December, Joseph Smith and Rigdon traveled from Fayette to Canandaigua, New York, and there continued work on Joseph Smith's inspired translation of the Bible. Shortly after their arrival, Joseph Smith dictated this revelation, which formally designated Ohio as a gathering place for the Church of Christ. 3 days later, on the 2nd of January, 1831, the third conference of the church convened in Fayette, and there Joseph Smith announced the plan to gather in Ohio. So further to this, we get this revelation also directed Joseph Smith and Rigdon to temporarily stop their revision of the Bible so they could preach to and strengthen the existing congregations in New York before the move to Ohio. They preached in public venues and believers' homes in Canandaigua, Palmyra, Fayette, and Colesville. And that is a major thing here. So basically he's saying, I want you to stop everything you're doing, and it's time to move to Ohio. And that's where they designated it. So in my opinion, that would mean that this mission was successful because they wound up moving there and they got, they found believers there and it was a successful mission and all that. Um, I think that could be up for interpretation for other people, but my opinion is that that was kind of a successful mission. And so it's a very short revelation, basically saying, please stop translating. You'll do this again later, but I need you guys to pick up and leave New York. And he says this for a couple of reasons. It's this New Jerusalem idea. It's preaching along the way, but it's also maybe even for their safety. There was a lot of persecution in the New York area at the time. So I think this was also for the safety of the saints. So there you go. That is section 37. So moving on to section 38, as we have it today. It is the first copy that we have is found in Revelation book 1. This is the 41st commandment. And again, there's some grammatical corrections and some wording clarifications and things like that. Nothing major, but something that should be noted. It is chapter 40 in the Book of Commandments, and it is section 12 in the 1835 Doctrine and Covenants. And there are no differences in the section headings between 1981 and 2013. This is on the longer side to this point in the Doctrine and Covenants. This is kind of a longer revelation that we receive here. And at this point, we actually turn the page over in the manuscript history. So now we are in chapter 12 in the manuscript history, and we get this introduction circumstantially to section 38 as we have it today. It says, the year 1831 opened with a prospect great and glorious for the welfare of the kingdom. For on the 2nd day of January 1831, a conference was held in the town of Fayette, New York, at which the ordinary business of the church was transacted. And in addition, the following elevation was received. I think they meant revelation was received. So that is what you get from the manuscript history. So we have left 1830. So just a couple of words about quite a big, huge year for the church. You have the publication of the Book of Mormon. You have the organization formally of the church. You have first missions. You have major converts coming in. They've already, increased their numbers quite substantially, which is apparently, maybe not that hard to do considering they were so small to begin with. And yeah, so that's 1830, big, huge year. So the start, I'm talking the 2nd of January. We're back at it again with a conference and this thing of like, by the way, I know we just did this a few months ago. We're all moving and we need to sell our properties, right? Pretty big deal. Anyway, so Revelation book 1 calls this the 41st commandment, January 2nd, AD 1831, received at Fayette, I think it's Fayette, Seneca County, State of New York, a commandment to the churches in New York at a conference, they being commanded to flee to Ohio. That's how it was described in Revelation book 1. Again, very little that we get in the Revelations printed for in their introductions. So from the Doctrine and Covenants, the Book of Commandments, again, revelation to the church, given this date and this time, and that's it. Well, we get out of John Whitmer's history. So again, this is out of Histories Volume 2, leading up to this revelation. It says, the time had now come for the general conference to be held, which was the 1st of January, 1831. So that's not correct. It was actually the 2nd, which is okay. And according to this appointment, the saints assembled themselves together. After transacting the necessary business, Joseph the seer addressed the congregation and exhorted them to stand fast, looking forward, considering the end of their salvation. The solemnities of eternity rested on them, the congregation, and having previously received a revelation to go to Ohio, they desired to know somewhat more concerning this matter. Therefore the seer inquired of the Lord in the presence of the whole congregation, and thus came the word of the Lord, saying, and then you get the revelation. So this is another very interesting thing, is that some revelations are secret, some are given through mediums, like a Urim and Thummim or a seer stone. Some are just Joseph in front of everybody, asking the Lord for a revelation and receiving one, apparently, according to this. So there's a lot of different ways revelations are received, but it's not always in a dark room or in a corner somewhere. sometimes they're out in the open, which is kind of cool. So the historical introduction from Documents Volume 1, so the previous one is Histories Volume 2, says, recalling the conference later, Newell Knight noted that, quote, we were instructed as a people to begin the gathering of Israel, and a revelation was given to the prophet on this subject, unquote. So there you go, Newell Knight and his wonderful journals that we still have. I believe that there is a very human response to this revelation. So at the time, land ownership was wealth. That's just the way it was. It wasn't cash like we have it today. There was no codified system of money in many cases, which led to some problems we won't get into. But land was where it was at, and that's how you got your food, and that's how you made your money, and that's what you passed on to your children. That was a big deal. So to have everybody up and leave is a big deal. And so a very human response to this revelation that we get from the historical introduction. It says, some church members were reticent to leave their homes and relocate to Ohio. And a few, according to Whitmer, even wondered if, quote, Joseph had invented it, the revelation, himself to deceive the people, that in the end he might get gain, unquote. Several weeks later, a resident of Waterloo, New York, wrote that, quote, this command was at first resisted by such as had property, the brethren from the neighboring counties being all assembled by special summons. But after a night of fasting, prayer, and trial, they all consented to obey the holy messenger, unquote. So that could have been sarcastic, who knows? Joseph Smith's mother saw the revelation in a positive light. She wrote to her brother Solomon Mack to explain that after they had gathered together, God would come to reign on earth with them 1,000 years. She also indicated, quote, we expect to go away to the Ohio early in the spring, unquote. This was a tough one, and I think rightly so. I think it makes a lot of sense. This would be a tough one to hear, I think, for a lot of people. The positive light and the idea surrounding a special gathering place may have come from the translation of the Bible. Again, in the history of the church, the manuscript history of the church, previous to section 37, you have Moses chapter 7, this vision of Enoch. So footnote 2 from the Joseph Smith papers gives us this. An account of Enoch's community called Zion was recorded around December 1830 as part of Joseph Smith's ongoing revision of the Bible. Enoch and all his people walked with God, and he dwelt in the midst of Zion. And it came to pass that Zion was not, for God received it up into his own bosom, and from thence went forth the saying, Zion is fled. So that's a quote from Moses chapter 7, or the vision of Enoch, I should say. The prophecy of Enoch, excuse me. Footnote 6 gave another reason based on a previous revelation. So this is from section 37, verse 1. The introduction here. The revelation that first directed Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon to go to Ohio stated that they were to do so, quote, because of the enemy and for your sakes, unquote. So like I was mentioning before, there was kind of a safety reason for this as well. There was some persecution going on in upstate New York that became a real problem and had been a real problem since the whole Book of Mormon story came out. So some footnotes in the revelation itself. So we're not going to read the revelation itself. I would encourage you to do so. This is section 38 again. But footnote 10 from the Joseph Smith Papers, Documents Volume 1, says, a series of revelations recorded the following month came to be known to the church as the law, quote unquote, which are section 42, which will be discussed in a later episode. So all these different revelations that we get will later be combined into section 42. So why I say that is because one of the things it says is gather to the Ohio and there you will receive my law. And that law that they already received, they did eventually do, but that's going to be for another episode pretty soon coming up. I think maybe next episode we'll be talking about that. So another quote from the Revelation says this is from, again, section 38 as we have it now. And now I give unto the church in these parts a commandment, that certain men among them be appointed, and they shall be appointed by the voice of the church, and they shall look to the poor and the needy, and administer to their relief, that they shall not suffer, and send them forth to the place which I have commanded them. And this shall be their work, to govern the affairs of the property of the church. So why am I reading that? Well, footnote 12 explains who these people were. So who was appointed? Newell Knight directed the migration of the church members from Colesville, New York, to Ohio. Martin Harris led those in Palmyra, New York area, which I think is appropriate. And Lucy Mack Smith and Thomas B. Marsh led those living near Fayette, New York. So Lucy Mack is a major force for helping to gather and move saints. And I would argue that Lucy, as well as Emma, Joseph's wife, did a lot to relieve the suffering of a lot of people during this time. And I'm sure we may hear about that as this series continues. But they were a major part of that. So I just thought that was interesting that it says men, and it's Newell Knight, and it's Martin Harris, and it's Thomas B. Marsh, but Lucy Mack Smith got in there too, and that was okay with everybody. So there you go. This was a hard thing for these saints to perform, as we were saying before. So footnote 13 gives a little bit more here. It says each congregation in New York made plans to leave for Ohio as a group. With several properties coming on the market at the same time in a given locality, land prices dropped considerably. Newell Knight later recorded, quote, "As might be expected, we were obliged to make great sacrifices of our property," unquote. The value of their homes dropped a lot. So right off the bat, these people are not only asked to leave behind a lot of their social clout and their standing in their communities and all that stuff, but they also lost a significant amount on the properties that they sold. So this was a major sacrifice. We've already gone into this in a previous episode, but it should be mentioned that at this point, John Whitmer places the Articles and Covenants of the Church, or what we call Section 20, in the Revelation book. So if I was going chronologically by the Revelation books that we have, the next thing that we would be talking about is going way back to Section 20 and the Articles and Covenants of the Church. So just so that you know, that's kind of where we are in the book. And that will be concluding part 1. So Section 37 and 38, a little bit about the translation of the Bible and the effect that it had. And then we also have the next commandment, which is to move states. And if you're not familiar with the church, I'm just going to give you the end statement here. But the headquarters of the church was more or less like kind of upstate New York. We're now leaving that, and we're going to make it Kirtland, Ohio. And then we're going to leave that, and it's going to be Nauvoo, Illinois. And that's going to be where Joseph is shot. The saints will have the famous extermination order that if you're a Latter-day Saint, you are to be killed. And that was a ratified document by a governor of a state of the United States, which is an interesting point in American history. And so the saints leave with the intention of going to Oregon country, or even Texas, but they wind up landing in Utah. And Latter-day Saints have had their headquarters in Salt Lake City, Utah ever since. So those are the four. So this is a pretty big movement that we've gone from 1 to headquarters number 2. And in our next section, we're going to be talking about James Colville and a revelation that was, quote unquote, not to be printed. So scandalous. Stay tuned for part 2.